Okay, here we are now in the University of Illinois Library, and we're preparing these videos for online classes because a lot of people who are our students in the College of Ed can't actually come here and visit the university, can't actually be here. So what we're doing today is we're bringing the library to you, and we're talking today about the evolution of knowledge architectures around early books. And particularly we want to be showing you some of the very first modern textbooks, because there is some very interesting lessons in the way these are designed and laid out and the way in which they're built as knowledge architectures. So what I want to introduce you to is I want to introduce you to Marten Stromberg, who is a curator of rare books here in the University of Illinois Library. And I was going to start off, Marten, by asking if you give us a little bit of a background to the library and this collection and the job that you do.
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, this library, the Rare Book Library, has been around since the 40s as the Rare Book Room, and before that sort of as the, early books room, 16th century room, what have you. And the collection started out primarily as a collection of John Milton and Shakespeare materials. These two sort of foundational collections, but it's grown much larger since. And we've got a large variety of different collections. One of the reasons we have specifically strong educational holdings is that our early Shakespeare collector decided he wanted to collect everything that Shakespeare and his contemporaries would have read from the time that they were boys until the time that they were old. So we have a large collection of 16th century textbooks, mostly what would have been found in England. But our collection is very diverse. We've got 19th century American wit and humor, we've got free speech collections, we've got emblem books, we've got anything you name it, the papers of H.G. Wells, his original manuscripts and things like that. So it's a rich and wide collection. I'm happy to show some of the really great early books for the class as well.
Great. Well, one of the amazing things is, until I came here to the University of Illinois, I had no idea that this collection was here. And it really is quite an amazing collection. And we're going to start with this particular piece of text here, which is amazingly the first 16 pages, I think, of the Gutenberg Bible. So can you give us, it's the first printed object in human history, the first book that's actually printed. So here it is in front of us, which is just amazing. So can you give us a bit of an introduction to this, this book, Marten?
Absolutely. So Gutenberg is the inventor of print in the West, right? Of course, printing on, cut wood blocks and even on some movable type existed in the East before. But Gutenberg is the one who sort of invents it in the West, I guess you could say, not the real originator necessarily. But this is the Gutenberg Bible, which is the first printed, let's say, major work of Gutenberg, and one of the very earliest. Of course, he didn't start printing a full Bible right away. He did some experiments, printed some indulgences. Obviously, it's like printing money, smart thing to do. But I can should I open this up?
Please do, and show us inside.
What we have here is, of course, you can tell, not a complete Gutenberg Bible, but a sizable fragment of the Gutenberg Bible, which includes all of Genesis and the very beginning of Exodus. And it's designed and looks just like a medieval manuscript would have around the area of Mainz where Gutenberg was printing at the time that he was printing. If you put them side by side, it's almost hard to distinguish one against the other. And you can see some particular features about the book that are interesting and sort of model manuscript practice. First of all, of course, the typography is this very, this black letter type, and there's two columns that are fully justified. Even breaks in words go all the way to the end and sort of not hyphenate at this time, but there are markings for sort of showing where the words go over. Also within this book, there are rubrications. There's manuscript additions to this book. And the way it would have been printed would have been to be sort of elaborated in that way, right? You've got sort of, these are all hand-drawn. So it's printed with movable type, printed with metal and ink, but still they're using some of the same conventions of writing in sort of the headings and the initial capitals that are found at the beginning of these paragraphs, I guess you could call them, although there are really no paragraph marks you can see within the page, and sort of Roman numerals for the various chapters.
Now, a couple of things about this is just adding my perspective to this, are revolutionary. One is that what Gutenberg builds is a character set. So he builds And you know, when they talk about uppercase and lowercase, the uppercase was the block letters, and then the lowercase was the small letters. And so, in other words, this is such a profound modern idea, because most modern manufacturing is based on the modularization of repeatable elements.
Absolutely.
So what he could do is produce hundreds of A's and hundreds of B's and hundreds of C's, and this was just extraordinary technology. So that was one aspect of this technology which was revolutionary. Another aspect of it which wasn't revolutionary, and he took it from wine presses, is the idea of a press.
Right.
So what would happen with every page, so the typographer would lay out all these letters in a form, and then a press would then screw down like that, page by page, and there were only 600 copies of this made.
Right.
Now, how many copies are existing in the world still, and we're in front of one of them?
Yeah, there are very few copies remaining, and you can't buy them anymore.
Of course, yeah.
No one will sell them. They're standing offers for complete copies. And this one was printed on paper, but some of them were printed on vellum,
right,
which would have been a traditional surface for manuscript writing. But I mean, I think that the point that you raised about sort of the innovation of movable type really changes everything, and the technological realization, the implications of that technology, I guess we'll see sort of realized across some of the books that we have in front of us.
So, so you know, this is quite, you know, it's an amazing artifact. This is one of the artifacts that changes the world, and here we have it in front of us. Now, what's also very interesting about this is that it's also not modern, right? And that's what we're going to talk about, the evolution of the way in which textual material is presented, but then how it's presented pedagogically for learners to learn. So let's just talk about this. Now, what are some of the things about this which are profoundly pre-modern, profoundly medieval?
Well, I mean, certainly, like I said, sort of the layout, this traditional layout. You see these manuscript columns. Again, sort of the rubrication that's in here. There's things that are lacking from this text. I think that's really how you can define some of the early elements, is what's missing from it, right? Like we'll see in the Geneva Bible later, you see chapter numbers, but there's no verse numbers within here, right? There's actually no page numbers whatsoever. These sort of large margins, it's again sort of the space on the page itself is imitating early manuscript practice, and part of that is sort of, you know, in any kind of manuscript you want the ability to annotate. And so with these kind of large marginal sections, you're able to comfortably add annotations. Although with a work like this, maybe you wouldn't necessarily want to write in it too much. But you may, if you're sort of a scholar of the Bible.
Now, I've only ever seen one other of these. There's another copy of this in the Widener Library at Harvard University. And the interesting thing that makes this quite a beautiful copy is the Widener one is illuminated all around the edges, like a medieval manuscript. So in other words, the only bit that's modern in that really is the typography, but then they try and recreate a medieval manuscript where every copy is beautifully illuminated around the edges.
Well, if you think about the economics of it, Gutenberg really did want to try to take this new technology and have it be a faster way of producing the same thing that there already was a market for.
Right. So here we are. We have this manuscript. It has no table of contents. It has no page numbers. It has no indexing.
No title pages.
No title pages. So it's really a medieval manuscript. Now what we're going to do now is go and look at a very early invention of new information architectures in another book. So I wonder now whether you might describe this next book to us and describe the kinds of innovations that are happening in this book.
Absolutely. Well, let's open it up and take a look. We can find out sort of what it is. It's a history text, essentially. And one of the really interesting things is, again, we open this up. There's no title page. You know, there's no. In fact, most books at this time, and we'll check in the back here and see if there is one in this copy. Most books at this time have what's called a colophon, where sort of the information about the printer, about the date that it was printed, and other information like that is found at the end of the book instead of at the beginning. But in this case, this opens straight up into what is an early printed index, subject index. You get really primitive subject indexes in manuscripts starting around the 1300s. But they're very simple, and they start to become more complicated. There's several reasons for this. I mean, I guess when you look at this particular history text from the 1480s, you can see that it looks kind of like an index, and there's all these numbers along the side. Well, like we saw, no page numbers in the Gutenberg Bible. This has not exactly page numbers, but each what we call leaf. So if you think of a page as, page 1, page 2, each leaf is numbered, and it indicates to you whether sort of the right side or the left side of the leaf is to be referenced for that particular text. And of course, it becomes more and more advanced subsequent to this, where every page becomes numbered regularly in print copies, where the indexes become more regular. And really importantly, and what needs to be stressed, I think, about the major shift from manuscript to print is that once you have an established edition where you're producing 1,000 copies of something, where every copy is the same word or section can be found on the same page, referenced across these 1,000 copies, then you avoid the problem that manuscript had, which is that every time you recopy a book, the location of a particular idea on a page changes. Whereas now with print, for any particular print run, you can reference, you could have a footnote at the bottom that references the edition printed in 1542 that has this subject on this particular page. So you see the beginnings of that here.
That becomes incredibly important. There's quite a lovely book written by Anthony Grafton called The Footnote, A Curious History. And what Anthony Grafton says is that what's evolving here is a way of thinking. So the minute you can actually say, I got this piece of information from page 54 in this particular book with this title and this author, and the other person can find that page again, you've got knowledge which is grounded in textual authority. So what it's about, it's actually about building a whole knowledge system, which becomes the modern knowledge systems that we learn in school and learn in universities.
Absolutely. This sort of idea of, much like the sciences, the idea of verifiability of a particular claim becomes important and sort of relevant in this, and it allows that, foundationally allows that system to then be constructed and be reliable. Some of the other interesting parts, and these are things that you will find also in manuscript, but these elements become printed. A lot of the visual and graphical elements and the layout of the page, I think, are really, some of them borrowed from manuscript, but they become to be more and more developed, I think, through print practice. And this is probably resembling much of what you'd see in a manuscript, but there becomes an increased demand with certain techniques such as woodcuts. You can make an illustration much more cheaply, whereas before you might have to send your copy off to the Netherlands, have someone hand draw an illustration, maybe copied from a template that they'd created. Instead, you can have one woodcut and you can print,
And actually what we're about to see in one of these later books is we're about to see educational diagrams illustrating things visually. We're going to get to that in a moment. Okay, so now we're moving on to sort of another step in this evolution of this textual form.
Absolutely. So these are 16th century books. We're into the next century. The early period of printing from, in the 15th century is called the Tunable Period, right? It's the period where, out of the cradle, the very earliest part of printing.
So talk to us about this book. Give us a bit of a background about what the book is, and tell us about what's happening as an information architecture in this book.
So this book is the 1560 Geneva Bible. It's the first printing of the Geneva Bible, which is sort of a Bible printed in exile, Protestant Bible printed in exile. And what you have is it's an English, of course, an English Bible. And the English Bible isn't printed until surprisingly late because it's sort of banned. There are these ideas of people, whether they should read the Bible in the vernacular, or it should be read in the Latin text, Shouldn't say original Latin because, the Latin Bible is originally a Vulgate as well. But this particular text is interesting because it's really the earliest English study Bible, where it includes a lot of things that aren't in earlier Bibles that allow you to use the text in a different way. And our copy is unfortunately lacking a title page, but it was originally printed with one. And it starts out, and I don't know what you'll be able to catch here on the camera, but this text has the beginning of the book of Genesis. And as you go through, you can see that this copy has chapter numbers, like the Gutenberg Bible, but it also has the verse numbers. So if you think about the manuscript period, before they had page numbers, they would have to reference whatever section, some abbreviation for a section of a particular book, and then within that section, another subsection, so that you could somehow navigate the text, but not quite as efficiently. Within this sort of biblical reference is done, as we know, by chapter and verse. Right. So here you can see that you can look at a particular book of Genesis, find chapter 18 here and go to verse, whichever verse, I won't read it, but verse 7 and have that particular reference. You've got this system, like you said, of reference that's possible. And theological scholarship is one of the earliest examples of where this is very important.
Right.
Where people are very concerned about it, at least.
Talk about these annotations down the side, because that's another interesting development in this text. Absolutely.
So as you saw in the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, there's these large margins that are there for people to write in annotations, if they will, which is sort of standard manuscript practice. Well, here they've actually printed annotations, and in this particular text, they're sort of interpretive. Right. A lot of them are interpretive. Some of them reference other portions of the Bible, and perhaps even, I'd have to look, there may be other texts that are referenced within these notes. But some of the interesting features of this Bible are that you have also these illustrations of things that are happening in the Bible.
Right.
Now, because of the nature of this Protestant text, there is no imagery of holy figures within the text, really, right? But you've got imagery of places and other sort of historical things.
Now, let me do a quick characterization then of a kind of a pedagogical shift that happens with Protestantism in a way, which is, okay, we want people to be able to read the text in the vernacular, to learn the text in order to become people of the faith. This non-linear stuff allows you to look up a particular verse of the Bible to which it's referred, because you are now a reader and you can look it up in your vernacular, and all the annotations direct you to things, they show you cross-references. So this is a user's book.
Absolutely.
Right? Whereas
Absolutely.
the Vulgate, St. Jerome's original, the Latin text, which only the priest could read because you didn't know Latin, where the priest was the font of all knowledge, that was not really a pedagogical text. This is designed to be a text that ordinary people can access, and it was so darn subversive you couldn't do it in England at the time.
That's right, yeah. And I think that's really an interesting point, that they make it, like you said, a user's Bible. They make it easy. This idea of ease of use totally comes into play, and sort of access to the text is increased.
And by access, it actually is about you becoming the person of the faith by being someone who can learn and use the text itself, which you could never do before in the world of Catholicism and the Latin Bible. And so this is a part of the whole logic of Protestantism. So,
just for the sake of curiosity, maybe I can show some of these fold-out.
Oh, wow, aren't they beautiful?
Fold-out maps.
Yeah, there's a little map. Oh, isn't that beautiful?
Tells you where to attach it.
Yeah.
So,
lovely. Okay, so now what we're going to move on to now in the next text is this person by the name of Petrus Ramos. And I might give a quick summary of my view of who Petrus Ramos is and why I think he's a remarkably important person. He was a professor at the University of Paris. He lived from 1515 to 1572. And he was perhaps one of the most prolific authors of this early modern period. So this is in the Gutenberg Bible that we've just looked at is 1452.
1454 to 55 is when it's finally completed.
Oh, okay, fine. Okay, well, it's in that type of period. So we're talking about the next century, the 16th century. And what he does is he sort of doesn't have an original thought in his head. But what he does is he regurgitates the classic as textbooks. And these are the textbooks that he uses to teach his students at the University of Paris.
In some ways, you can think of him as an advanced student who's been trying to learn this material and found some of the methodologies difficult for himself.
That's right. Yeah. Now, let me tell you the difference between... So what he does is he talks about Aristotle's logic, Aristotle's rhetoric, classical geometry. So all these topics, rhetoric, logic, geometry, they're all here in these books. But what's interesting is he presents it in a unique way. So if you go back and you look at Plato, not so much Aristotle, but certainly classical Greek philosophy, it's very dialogical. It's the repetition of dialogues and conversations that are held by philosophers. Now, what Ramos does is he radically reconstructs that in a number of ways. Firstly, what he does is he chunks this information so it's presented in this analytical, logical kind of way, starting with the simpler and going to the hardest, but he builds it as something which is explicitly a pedagogical text. And apparently, in his classes at the University of Paris, there were up to 2,000 students. So the textbook then becomes really important because he's just standing at the front of the lecture hall, and the textbook then becomes what the students know they have to learn, right? So would you walk us through one of these books and explain a little bit how it works? We'll start with a Latin text first, and then we'll look at some of these when they were translated into English.
So this is one of the texts that was published during his lifetime, 1566, so just 6 years later than the Geneva Bible. You see you've got your title page here. This has sort of been established now. Your print information down at the bottom of the front. And you've got all these interesting portions of the book that weren't present before. You've actually got a preface here. Right. And if we move, okay, so we'll start moving through. So here's the first book of the dialectic. And this is all in Latin. And you can actually see that people have put their own marginal notes into the side of the text here. But
not only does it have page numbers, but it has line numbers. You can actually, so if the lecturer is at the front of the room, he can say, well, Petrus Ramos can say, turn to this page, look at this line, this is what we're learning at the moment.
Yeah, that's why you always need to get the correct edition for your classroom if you're looking
at but it's the beginning of this idea, we're all on the same page at the same time.
Yeah, exactly, right. On the same page at the same time. It's a really good point. And so what's very interesting about this particular text, and you can't really see just from looking at the physical object like this, but which is definitely true, is sort of the rearrangement that's going on that you mentioned before, the way that Ramos is interpreting these classic thinkers and representing the material in a way that he thinks will make sense to his students.
So these are the first textbooks in a way, and education before this point had been either informal or dialogical in the classical Academy of Athens, and these were the very first textbooks, and building this kind of analytical way of presenting knowledge for pedagogical purposes, for the purposes of learning. Okay.
So we can look at sort of a later adaptation of this. I mean, this is printed in 1566, but it's still considered important as an educational text later in England also. We've got an English edition here, and I think we can kind of talk about how it's paired with sort of a classical text here. And you've got the art of logic delivered in the precepts of Aristotle and Ramos. So Thomas Spencer, who's the author of this particular book, is taking Ramos and Aristotle and putting them sort of side by side.
Right.
And
translating it into English.
And translating it into English. And in that way, interestingly, in some ways he's mirroring Ramos's process.
Yeah, that's right.
Where he's starting to rearrange this material to show it side by side. And I think that's very interesting that you've got, and this is 1638 looks like the publication date for this particular text. This book's in kind of rough shape.
So we have chapter numbers, we have chapter headings, we have page numbers, we have stuff laid out in this analytical kind of way.
Yeah, and you can see here he's got on the right-hand side, he's got what's the equivalent of kind of an early running head, instead of having sort of the
so you can flip through and find where you're up to.
At the top, you've got Ramos written here on the right when he starts with Ramos, and there he'll begin Ramos again. He'll note probably when he's dealing with Aristotle and when he's dealing with Ramos. So.
And let's look at this one. This is one of my favorites. This is again an English language geometry text. So it's an English language translation of Ramos, I think again in the 17th century, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
But what's very interesting about this is not only is it laid out in this very analytical kind of way, this is a real book as we recognise it with the title page and contents, but also what's interesting is the use of diagrams, pedagogical illustrative diagrams. So you'll talk to us about that.
There's another really great 17th century change that is that I think is just absolutely wonderful that I just noticed now looking at this title page again, which is this idea of the trades and the professions becoming unified in terms of practical application. Ramos was definitely all about practical application, and that's one of the problems he had with the traditional educational models that he learned under, was that he didn't see them as practicable. He went through and learned all of this logic, and he wasn't able to apply it properly as he wanted to. Yeah. And you can see here, this is the way to geometry being necessary and useful for astronomers, geographers, land meters, seamen, engineers, architects, carpenters, painters, carvers, etc.
That's lovely, isn't it? Yeah.
So you've got here this English translation. You see that all different kinds of texts are starting to be targeted towards people who are training for a profession. Mm-hmm. And again, you've got an introduction, this dedication here, extended dedication to John Greaves, Professor of Geometry, by the translator, looks like. And then you've got a to the reader.
So this is a very familiar modern book. There's the author's preface.
And now we have an author's preface, absolutely, right. Yeah.
Okay. And then what's interesting is when we get into the book itself, it's laid out analytically, bit by bit, chapter by chapter. There's the table of contents with the page numbers. So, you know, there's a section there on right angles, a section there on oblongs, a chapter on all these geometry topics. And then when we get to them, it's all, you know, laid out from the simpler things to the more complicated things. And we've got these beautiful diagrams which illustrate what these geometrical concepts mean.
Yeah, see. Here's the first section. Geometry is the art of measuring well.
Yeah.
It's a nice little passage there. But you can kind of move through, and of course, they're starting to include, and earlier they had as well, but starting to include these figures, which are very, very important, obviously, for
particularly
geometry.
Something like geometry.
And they start out very, very simplistically, where you've got sort of, I don't know what you can see from there, but some, you know, triangles, squares, circles, and it starts out simple. And you almost don't even need to read any of the text to sort of know what they're talking about. If you have had some geometry, right? Yeah. You can kind of just move through and look at the figures, and you know where you are. You know what they're talking about, in some sense.
Now, for me, this between the Gutenberg text that we've seen and this, we've come fully into modernity.
Yeah,
and one of the things that I think is that, in fact, the internet it doesn't advance on this. This is actually the internet. You know why? Because when you've got a contents page and you've got page numbers and you've got indexes and you've got stuff laid out analytically, you might as well call it hyperlinks. So the idea that you can access knowledge, you can find exactly the right thing and you want a particular page, on a particular page. So the idea that text is not just linear. So that Gutenberg text was relentlessly linear. You have to turn over page by page because there was no way to navigate it any other way.
That's absolutely true. There's no entry into the book any way than just reading it straight through, like you said.
Now, when we talk about the internet being characteristically non-linear, this is a non-linear text. This is, okay, we're going to work on chapter 7 today and we're going to refer to something on page 46 because it's in the index. So all these apparatuses that we build, and in fact the apparatuses are contents, indexes, but also whole bibliographical systems, a whole library. So you can find that book in the library on that page, which is catalogues. These essentially, this is the logic, the same logic as the internet. Exactly the same logic. And for me, what I say, often say facetiously, is the most revolutionary invention of all is the page number.
Yeah.
Because it means you can find stuff and it's always there on the same page if the editions are the same, unlike manuscripts, which are always different.
Right. And of course, page number is a result of the process of movable type, coming back to that sort of the standardization of a print, of an object being in many copies, sort of the same. And something that I think is interesting about your internet analogy is is this fundamentally the same? It speeds things up, of course.
Yeah, of course.
It does speed things up, but
although I can get to page 78 pretty quickly if I just do that.
Absolutely. And there's something that I think in some cases is lost on the internet that still is retained in these original books. And sort of the same way the page number arises out of the regularity of what's here. When you have a book in your hand that you've read and seen before, you know
a lot of visual memory.
Where about in that book that particular passage is. You remember where on the page that's located. When you're scrolling through a document, you don't necessarily, maybe sometimes if you use it a lot, you'll remember where that position of the scroll bar is, but the books have this innate advantage of the physical memory that you have and the association you have with a particular piece of knowledge within it.
So anyhow, look, this is a big shift in the way human beings document their knowledge and access their knowledge. And the important thing from my point of view is the development of these text types which are designed to be pedagogical, laying stuff out in little bits, accessible in multiple ways, and this becomes all the good and the bad things of the textbook, you know. So for me, that's that interesting. What's interesting is in this time period between 1450 and here we are now by the 17th century, with this particular text, all these things get invented. A little footnote which I think is quite, I'm amused, it's just vaguely amusing. In his lifetime, Ramos converts to being a Protestant. So in other words, you know, the difference between those old, the Latin Vulgate and these texts now, which are pedagogical texts so people can learn, you know, he's part of that modern mentality, that modern movement. Anyhow, there was a very violent reaction in France in 1572.
Right.
And on Bartholomew's Day, 1572, he was murdered in what's called the Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Now, it's a bit of a, it's perhaps a legend that it may well be one of his students that murdered him. So, but nevertheless,
Didn't like his textbooks.
There was maybe the textbooks were so terrible, and sitting in the lecture theatre with 2,000 people was so unbearable. I don't know. I'm sure it was ideological, but you know, on that particular day, quite a few thousand people were murdered, and he was one of the people who was murdered on that particular day in 1572. Wow. But anyhow, look, it's been interesting just to be able to talk about this modern evolution and talk about him as a kind of a symptomatic person.
Right.
And the educational ideas and the ideas around knowledge architectures, I think there are some very interesting and important lessons for us. So what can I say other than thank you very much
I'm glad you could come in and see the books.
Yeah, thank you very much for showing us all these books, not just me, but all the other people who can watch these videos who can't necessarily get here into these rooms and see these beautiful...
Well, you know, if you do come by, we are open to the public. You can come visit our library anytime, register with us, and look at any of these books yourself.
Okay, there you go. There's your invitation. Come and see Marten anytime and he'll show them to you. So.